It was one of those mornings where the sun seemed like it had a personal vendetta. The air was thick, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every step feel like an uphill climb. But Jim Cartwright wasn't the kind of man to let a little heat slow him down. No, sir. At 42, he had been through worse, much worse, and today was just another day in his lifelong battle against the unspoken injustices of the world. Jim had parked his car, an old but dependable Ford Crown Victoria. Yes, the same model cops loved, though his didn't come with the flashing lights, by the side of the road. The car was a reflection of the man, sturdy, unpretentious, and utterly unapologetic. He leaned against the hood, dressed in a crisp button-down that somehow refused to wilt under the oppressive heat, and surveyed the scene before him. The construction crew, a group of hard-working men with faces weathered by the sun and hands calloused from years of labor, were laying fresh asphalt on the cracked road. Most of them were Latino, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that mixed Spanish and English, in a way that sounded like music to Jim's ears. He wasn't here to micromanage. That wasn't his style. Instead, he was here to talk, to listen, and to do what he did best: connect. "Fellas," Jim called out, his voice smooth but commanding. "How's it going out here? Heat treating you okay?" One of the workers, Miguel, Jim always remembered names, wiped his brow with a bandana and nodded. "It's hot, boss, but we're managing. Thanks for stopping by," Jim chuckled, crossing his arms over his chest. "Managing? Miguel, you're out here baking like a damn casserole, and you call that managing? You let me know if you need anything." "I mean it." The men laughed, their spirits lifted by Jim's humor. He had that effect on people, making them feel seen, respected. It was one of the reasons he had become a trusted figure in the community, though he rarely flaunted it. Just as Jim was about to dive into a conversation about workplace safety, because, let's face it, that was his thing, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A black and white squad car rolled up. Its sirens silent, but its presence loud as hell. Two officers stepped out, the kind of guys who looked like they'd been waiting for a reason to flex their authority all day. One was tall and broad, with a face that screamed bad mood, while the other was shorter, wiry, and carried himself with the smug confidence of a man who thought his uniform made him invincible. "Sir, can we have a word?" the taller one asked, his tone more demand than request. Jim raised an eyebrow, his body language calm but clearly unimpressed. "A word?" "Sure, I've got plenty. Which one do you want?" Miguel and the other workers exchanged nervous glances. They knew the drill. They'd seen it before. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area," the shorter cop said, his hand resting on the holster of his gun like it was some kind of security blanket. Jim couldn't help himself. He laughed, a low rumbling sound that only seemed to irritate the officers more. "Suspicious activity? Let me guess. Middle-aged black guy talking to hard-working folks must have set off someone's Karen radar." The taller cop's jaw tightened. "We need to see some ID." Jim sighed, pulling his wallet from his back pocket with deliberate slowness. "Sure thing, officer. Anything to help you feel like you're earning that paycheck." He handed over his driver's license, watching as the taller cop squinted at it like he was deciphering ancient hieroglyphs. "Step away from the car," the cop said suddenly, his voice sharper now. "Step away?" Jim repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You do realize I'm not about to rob my own damn vehicle, right?" The shorter cop had had enough. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Miguel stepped forward, his voice rising with urgency. "Hey, wait. He didn't do anything. He's just talking to us." "Stay out of this," the taller cop barked, pointing a finger at Miguel. Jim, meanwhile, stood frozen for a moment, a mix of disbelief and anger flashing in his eyes. But he didn't resist. He wasn't stupid. He knew how this game was played. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Jim couldn't resist one last jab. "You boys must be so proud. Big tough cops arresting a guy for what exactly? Talking? Breathing? Or is it just existing while black?" The officers ignored him, shoving him into the back seat of the squad car. Through the window, Jim could see Miguel and the others shouting in protest, their voices muffled but their anger clear. As the car pulled away, Jim leaned back against the seat, the cool leather pressing against his wrists. "Well," he muttered to himself, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That escalated quickly. The scene faded into the hum of the engine and the distant voices of the workers. Jim stared out the window, his mind racing, but one thought stood out above the rest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The holding cell smelled like a mix of sweat, stale air, and regret. Jim sat on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. The cuffs were off now, but their phantom weight still lingered. He scanned the room, a cracked concrete floor, bars that had seen too many desperate faces, and a flickering, fluorescent light overhead that hummed like an annoying mosquito. "Home sweet home," he muttered to himself, leaning back against the cold wall. Hours dragged by. No calls, no explanations, just silence punctuated by the occasional bark of a guard down the hall. Jim wasn't new to this, not the cell, but the treatment. He had seen enough of the system to know when someone was being taught a lesson. A guard finally sauntered in, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who thought he was above it all. His name tag read Daniels. "You got questions? I don't have answers," Daniels said flatly, dropping a paper cup of water on the bench next to Jim. "Oh, you're a real conversationalist," Jim shot back, his voice dry but sharp. He picked up the cup and took a sip. "What's the deal, Daniels? You boys just holding me here for fun? Or are we waiting for a parade?" Daniels smirked, leaning against the bars. "You're here because we said you're here. That's how it works." Jim locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. "Power trip, huh? Must be nice." Daniels shrugged, his smirk fading as he walked away. "Sit tight. You'll see the judge soon enough." 2 days passed, each hour blending into the next. The guards brought meals that looked like they were cooked with pure spite, and Jim forced himself to eat, knowing he'd need the strength. His mind wandered to the workers, Miguel's concerned face replaying in his head. Were they okay? Did anyone try to step up for him after he was hauled off? When they finally came to fetch him for his hearing, Jim felt a strange calm settle over him. He had spent enough time in his own thoughts to know one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this end quietly. As they led him out of the cell block, the fluorescent lights gave way to the dim sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows. Jim straightened his posture, his resolve unshakable. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, heavy and foreboding. But he was ready. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. The courtroom was buzzing like a beehive on a hot summer day. Jim walked in, flanked by 2 officers who looked more like bouncers than law enforcement. The audience, a mix of curious bystanders, reporters, and a few familiar faces from the community, turned to watch him like he was the main act in some twisted circus. Jim kept his head high, his expression calm, but his eyes scanned the room with razor-sharp focus. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a damn spectacle. He could feel the weight of every stare, the unspoken judgments filling the air. The judge, an older man with an impatient frown, and glasses perched precariously on his nose, banged his gavel. "Let's get this started." The prosecution wasted no time, painting Jim as a disturbance to the peace and hinting at potentially threatening behavior. The officers who arrested him gave their accounts, their words rehearsed and polished, like they'd spent all night practicing in front of a mirror. Jim sat quietly, his jaw clenched as the lies piled up. His lawyer, a young but sharp-witted woman named Cassandra, finally stood. "Your Honor," Cassandra began, her tone cutting through the courtroom like a knife. "Before we continue to tarnish my client's name, let's address the facts. Mr. Cartwright was arrested without cause while engaging in a conversation, a legal, peaceful conversation, with workers he advocates for." The room murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Advocates for? Explain." Cassandra smiled, a small, confident smirk. "My client is a member of the city council, a leader in this community. The officers who arrested him failed to recognize the very man who has spent years fighting for the rights of people like those construction workers." The silence that followed was deafening. Jim finally allowed himself a faint smile. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces pale. The judge leaned forward, his expression now one of curiosity, and maybe a little irritation. "Is this true?" one of the officers stammered. We didn't know." "You didn't know?" Cassandra interrupted, her voice sharp. "You didn't think to check, to verify before dragging an innocent man through this ordeal?" The room erupted into whispers. Jim leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor now laced with quiet satisfaction. Let them stew, he thought. Let them all realize how badly they'd misjudged him. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. But for the first time in 2 days, Jim felt like the scales were finally starting to tip in his favor. The courtroom was now a pressure cooker, ready to blow its lid. The air buzzed with tension as Jim stood, his presence commanding, even in handcuffs. The officers who'd dragged him here looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Cartwright, do you have anything to add?" Jim stepped forward, his voice calm, but laced with steel. "Your Honor, I'm not here to play victim. I'm here because 2 officers thought my skin color was enough to make me a suspect. That's the real crime in this room." The murmurs started again, but Jim didn't stop. "I was talking to workers, hard-working people trying to put food on the table. And for that, I was hauled off like a common criminal. No questions, no rights read. Just cuffs slapped on and a ride downtown." The judge raised a hand to quiet the room, his face a mix of irritation and something like guilt. Enough. I've heard enough. Jim's lawyer, Cassandra, stood again, her voice sharp. Your Honor, we are filing for immediate dismissal of all charges and a formal investigation into the conduct of these officers. The judge nodded, clearly ready to be done with this circus. Granted. Charges dismissed. Officers, you'll be hearing from Internal Affairs. The room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed and the officers looked like they'd swallowed a cactus. As Jim walked out, free at last, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Someone yelled, "You're a hero, Jim!" and applause broke out. He glanced over his shoulder at the two officers who stood frozen, their careers now dangling by a thread. Outside, the heat hit him like a slap, but this time it felt almost refreshing. Miguel and the crew were there, cheering. Jim gave a nod, his smile small but meaningful. Guess I'll see you boys on the next project, he said, his tone light but carrying an edge that said he wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about him, it was bigger, about justice, about change, and about making damn sure this wouldn't happen again. And Jim? He was just getting started. Thanks to everyone who tuned in to hear this story. We truly hope you enjoyed it. If it resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Life Mosaic. We're here to bring you the most gripping, thought-provoking stories, crafted with care just for you. Take care, stay inspired, and we'll catch you tomorrow.